Ah,
You got it there, kiddo? Solid.
awesome.
All right.
Okay, so do you feel the death penalty is ethical considering experiences?
No. Like I said earlier, I think that the amount of justice that a society could get, and let me break it down for you this way. The reason that I say that is, in my mind, it's a question of what is gained versus what is lost or potentially lost, right? And so, what is gained marginally over life in prison is maybe the slightest bit of revenge, maybe the slightest bit of more punishment for a crime that is already unspeakable. I mean, really, when you're talking about these types of crimes, they are the worst crimes that could possibly be committed, right? So there's nothing as a society that we can do to like get a eye for an eye retribution. Um, so maybe marginally you get some more justice or more punishment. Well, what do you potentially lose? That in my mind is the scary thing, and why and where ethically, even using death penalty proponents' own arguments or own sort of rationale for why the death penalty may be beneficial, um, I don't see how it works, because what you potentially lose is you could kill an innocent person. So there's the marginal increase potentially in justice that may be achieved by the death penalty. Granted, some justice is already being achieved through life in prison or whatever, but if you buy that more punishment is required, you might get a little bit more punishment. Well, at what cost? Well, at the cost of potentially executing somebody who didn't commit a crime. That cost to me is way too great for the potential benefit. And as a result, I don't see how, from the very argument that a person proposing the death penalty would be arguing from, could possibly defend that.
Okay, so what do you think are some other factors other than just executing someone wrongfully that might play into the death penalty being unethical?
Well, okay, so ethicists would call that what's called a utilitarian approach. In other words, we're going to examine how much benefit the death penalty gets versus how much cost the death penalty gets. So it's what a utilitarian philosopher or ethicist would say. There are other ethicists like deontologists that would say the only thing that we do to evaluate whether or not an action is ethical is examine the method of that action, the intent of that action, right? Immanuel Kant is one of these ethicists. What he would say is that ending a life deliberately is categorically wrong, right? The act of ending a life in any fashion is categorically wrong. And that's what I was trying to get at earlier, is that we recognize this in the justice system already. It's why defendants are so closely scrutinized when they're charged with murder, because we recognize that the act of ending another individual's life is wrong on its own face. And so I think that that's a similar rationale, is that on its face, ending the life of another person ought to be categorically rejected. And the state certainly shouldn't do that. There are other arguments to be made about the role of government. It's not the role of government to determine who lives and who dies. It's not the role of society to be able to take another person's life. In other words, society shouldn't be given that responsibility or that right to revoke the lives of other people. So those are three unique and different ethical prisms by which people might conclude that the death penalty is immoral, that it violates some utilitarian principle, that it violates some deontological principle, and that it violates what the government should be allowed to do.
Okay, and how many times do you think that assuming and jumping to conclusions has, well, experience wise, how many times has assuming someone is guilty and put to the death penalty,
Yeah.
how many times has it actually not been true?
Yeah, that I don't know. And it's difficult to know because once a guilty verdict is rendered, our justice system is unconcerned with the facts of the case. In other words, after a jury decides that a defendant is guilty, that's it. We are no longer concerned with whether the evidence in the case indicates the guilt of that person. All of the appeals process from that point forward deal with whether or not that person got a fair trial. And that's good. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. That's a really important part of our justice system. But what I am saying is that if a person is underrepresented by a poor attorney, or if a person can't afford an attorney, and instead is dropped in a public defender's lap who might have 200 cases going on at once, I'm not convinced that that person got the best defense that they could have received. And so, as a result, it would not surprise me at all if there is at least one person who has been imprisoned in the American criminal justice system and executed wrongly. And in my mind, one is plenty, right? That's all of the rationale you would need to not carry out a death penalty. If there is a chance that one person loses their life at the hands of the state and should not have lost their life at the hands of the state, that's enough to say we're not going to rely on this as a penalty. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think that's it.
Cool.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Good luck. Hope that helps.
It will. Thank you.
Sure.
Define death penalty in your own term.
The death penalty is where certain states, or in some cases countries, allow some form of punishment where the defendant who's found guilty ends up losing his or her life. It can manifest itself in a couple of different fashions historically. It's happened through things like a beheading, or that's way back in the day. More modernly, a firing squad, or the electric chair, or lethal injection.
Okay, so can you explain any cases that you have heard about or experienced or learned about to deal with or involving the death penalty?
There are a couple of them. I think that sort of, if you're thinking about the death penalty as a normative issue, that is to say, as an issue of whether we should or shouldn't do it, there are stories on both sides. So there are people like Timothy McVeigh, who I can remember in 2001, I think it was June, was sentenced to die and put to death after he bombed the Oklahoma City building in 1994. In that case, you're looking at families in a country that probably saw McVeigh's execution as a form of justice, as being repaid for something that was a crime against our society. At the same time, you've also got instances like what happened last month, where you have the state of Oklahoma that experienced a 45-minute long botched execution, where as a result of their inability to obtain the proper lethal injection drugs, an execution of a man goes on for an hour. The person's being tortured, basically, and he dies as a heart attack after they attempt to suspend the execution. In that case, opponents of the death penalty would likely look at that and say, here's an example of something where the death penalty's gone wrong. I think those are two examples on either end of the spectrum that you could point to and say, here's an example of where the death penalty may be doing some justice for society, and here's an example of where the death penalty is clearly a miscarriage of that justice.
And what do you think that the purpose of the death penalty serves?
What do I think that it serves, or what do people arguing on the behalf of the death penalty?
What do you think it serves?
I think if it serves a purpose, its purpose is revenge. And if that factors into justice, then I think that you could make an argument that it plays a role in justice. I don't see the taking of another people's life by the state or society as being something that's just. The other thing is I don't. I